The black soil of the eastern trenches stretched endless beneath October stars, carved into geometric scars that wept oil and blessed water in equal measure. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov pulled his woolen greatcoat tighter against the cold that seeped through his bones like communion wine through unleavened bread. His breath formed clouds of vapor that hung in the still air. Each exhalation a small prayer to saints whose names had been forgotten in the 8th century since Jerusalem's gates split open to reveal the mouth of perdition itself. Behind him, 11 Cossack riders checked their weapons with the methodical reverence of men who understood that each bullet might carry a fragment of blessed silver. Each blade might hold the last drops of oil from the Holy Sepulchre. Their horses stamped and snorted, eyes rolling white in the darkness as they caught scents that no earthly beast should recognize. These were not the swift ponies of the steppes, but heavy war horses bred in the shadow of New Antioch's walls, fed on grain, blessed by blind monks and watered from wells that touched the deepest aquifers of sanctified ground. The telegram had arrived 3 days ago, carried by a runner whose left arm ended in a stump wrapped with pages torn from the Book of Lamentations. The Heretic Legion outpost at Marker 47 reported attacks by phantom cavalry, riders who struck in the gray hour before dawn and vanished with the first rays of sun. 17 men dead, their bodies found arranged in patterns that hurt the eyes to contemplate, their faces locked in expressions of such rapture that the chaplains refused to perform last rites. Volkov spat into the mud, watching the saliva disappear into soil that drank everything and gave back only the metallic taste of old blood. He had seen phantom riders before, in the siege of Trebizond, where the starlit cult had summoned cavalry from the spaces between stars. Those had been easier to fight, beings of cold light and mathematical precision that could be banished with the proper geometry of blessed trenches. What waited ahead felt different, older, more rooted in the corrupted flesh of the world itself. Private Kozlov rode up beside him, his young face already marked by the gray pallor that touched all who served too long in the eastern trenches. The boy's horse, a mare named Vera after the saint who had wept tears of molten gold, tossed her head and whinnied softly. The sound carried further than it should have in the still air, echoing back from the network of trenches that spread like a spider's web across the landscape. "Sergeant," Kozlov whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of artillery that never quite stopped, a percussion that had become the heartbeat of this war without end. "The horses are restless. They smell something on the wind." Volkov nodded, though he did not look at the young man. His own mount, a gelding called Mikhail, after the archangel who had first drawn sword against the rebellion, shifted beneath him with the nervous energy of a beast that sensed predators moving just beyond the edge of sight. The horse's breath came in short puffs that seemed to form shapes in the air, suggestions of wings or claws that dissolved before the mind could properly grasp them. The outpost lay 3 kilometers ahead, a collection of reinforced bunkers and communication trenches built around the ruins of what had once been a monastery dedicated to Saint Cyril the Illuminator. The saint's bones still lay beneath the altar, it was said, though none who had ventured into the crypt had returned with their sanity intact. The Heretic Legion had fortified the ruins not out of reverence but practicality, using the ancient stones as foundation for machine gun nests and the bell tower as an observation post. As they rode closer, the smell reached them first. It was not the familiar stench of cordite and rotting flesh that marked every battlefield in this endless war, but something else entirely. Something that spoke of laboratories deep beneath the earth, of experiments conducted by men who had forgotten the distinction between science and heresy. The horses began to struggle against their bits, foam flecking their muzzles as they fought the urge to bolt. "Hold the line," Volkov commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had survived the massacre at the Shrine of Seven Sorrows and the siege of the Glass Cathedral. "Whatever waits ahead, we face it as soldiers of the Orthodox faith, inheritors of the true Byzantine legacy." The first trenches came into view as they crested a low hill, a network of earthworks that seemed to pulse with their own dark life. The parapets were lined with what appeared to be barbed wire at first glance, but as they drew closer, Volkov could see that the coils were made of something else entirely. Twisted metal that gleamed with an oily iridescence, fashioned into shapes that suggested thorns but moved with slow, deliberate purpose. The outpost itself squatted in the center of this maze like a wounded animal, its concrete walls stained with substances that defied identification. Windows that should have glowed with lamplight stood dark and empty, though shadows moved behind the glass with purpose that suggested intelligence rather than the random drift of wind-blown debris. Private Malkoff, a veteran of the Crimean Waste Wars whose beard had turned white after exposure to the breath of Moloch, raised his rifle and peered through the scope. The weapon was a masterwork of Orthodox engineering, its barrel blessed by 3 different patriarchs and its stock carved from wood taken from the true cross itself. Such relics were rare beyond measure, and Malkoff had earned his through acts of devotion that had cost him 2 fingers and most of his hearing in his left ear. "Movement in the trenches," he reported, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Something large, moving against the flow of the wind." Volkov raised his own field glasses, adjusting the blessed lenses until the distant trenches swam into focus. What he saw there made his breath catch in his throat like smoke from a censers filled with herbs that grew only in the gardens of paradise. The trenches were not empty, as they had appeared from a distance, but filled with a writhing mass of something that might once have been human. Figures in the gray uniforms of the heretic legion moved through the earthworks, but their movements were wrong, too fluid, as if their joints had been replaced with mechanisms that operated according to principles of anatomy unknown to God's creation. "Blessed Mother of Sorrows," whispered Corporal Petrov, crossing himself with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "What have they done to themselves?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that none of them wanted to consider. The heretic legion had always been willing to embrace modifications that the Orthodox Church considered abominations, trading pieces of their humanity for advantages in the endless war. But what moved in those trenches suggested experiments that went beyond mere augmentation, changes that touched the very essence of what it meant to be made in the image of the divine. As they watched, one of the figures in the trenches raised its head, and even at this distance, Volkov could see that its face was wrong. Too long, perhaps, or possessed of too many eyes, or arranged according to geometries that should not exist in a world created by a loving God. The thing that had once been a man opened what might have been its mouth, and a sound emerged that was felt rather than heard, a vibration that traveled through the ground and up through the bodies of their horses. The animals began to panic then, eyes rolling white as they fought against their rider's control. Vera reared up on her hind legs, nearly throwing Kozlov from the saddle, while Mikhail began to buck and twist with such violence that Volkov had to grip the reins with both hands to avoid being thrown. Around them, the other horses responded in kind, a cascade of terror that threatened to scatter the unit before they had even reached their objective. "Dismount," Volkov ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos, like a blade blessed by St. George himself. "Form a perimeter. The horses will only be a liability from here." The men obeyed with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had learned that survival depended on absolute obedience to orders, no matter how much their instincts screamed against compliance. They slid from their saddles and formed a defensive circle. Rifles pointed outward toward threats that could not yet be seen, but could be felt pressing against the boundaries of perception like fingers testing the strength of a locked door. The horses, freed from the weight of their riders, did not bolt as expected. Instead, they stood in a tight cluster, heads lowered and ears flattened against their skulls, as if they too understood that flight would offer no escape from whatever waited in the darkness ahead. Their breathing came in sharp, frightened gasps that formed clouds of vapor in the cold air. And more than one of the men noticed that those clouds seemed to take shapes that lingered longer than they should before dissolving into the night. From the trenches ahead came a new sound, a rhythmic pounding that might have been machinery or might have been something far worse. It was accompanied by a chanting in a language that none of them recognized, though the cadence was familiar from the dark masses held in the deepest vaults beneath New Antioch. Words that seemed to twist the air around them, creating distortions that made the eye water and the mind struggle to maintain its grip on concepts of distance and direction. "Sergeant," Kozlov whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing volume of the chant. "Should we retreat? Send word to command." Volkov considered the question for a moment that stretched like hours, weighing duty against survival, orthodoxy against pragmatism. The outpost had to be investigated, the nature of the threat determined and reported back to the generals who planned their strategies from comfortable bunkers hundreds of kilometers behind the front lines. But more than that, there were men in those trenches. Soldiers who had once sworn the same oaths and served the same cause, even if they had chosen to embrace heresies that placed their souls beyond redemption. "We advance," he decided, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "Whatever has happened here, whatever abomination has been birthed in those trenches, it cannot be allowed to spread. We are the thin line between the darkness and the lands that still remember the light of God's grace." They moved forward in formation, rifles ready and prayers on their lips. The ground beneath their feet felt wrong, too soft in some places and too hard in others, as if the very earth had been reshaped by forces that operated according to principles of geology known only in the deepest circles of hell. Their boots squelched in mud that seemed to cling with unusual tenacity, reluctant to release them with each step. The smell grew stronger as they approached the outer perimeter of the trench system, a mixture of ozone and copper that spoke of electricity and blood mingled in proportions that should not exist in nature. Underlying it was something else, a sweetness that reminded Volkov of the flowers that bloomed in the cemetery behind the cathedral where he had been baptized as a child. Before the war had taught him that death was not always a release from suffering. The first trench appeared before them suddenly, a gash in the earth that seemed to open like a wound as they watched. The sides were reinforced with what appeared to be concrete at first glance, but closer inspection revealed that the material was something else entirely. It had the color and texture of bone, but it curved and flowed in ways that suggested it had been grown rather than poured, shaped by processes that mimicked the slow accumulation of calcium in living creatures. Within the trench, shapes moved with purpose that suggested intelligence, though their forms defied easy categorization. They wore the uniforms of heretic legion infantry, but the cloth had been modified or perhaps fused with their flesh in ways that made it impossible to determine where fabric ended and skin began. Their movements were fluid and coordinated, like dancers following a choreography written in a language of gesture and posture that predated human speech. "Holy Mother of God," Petrov breathed, raising his rifle with hands that trembled like those of a man afflicted with palsy. "What are they?" Before Volkov could answer, one of the creatures in the trench turned toward them. Its face was a patchwork of human features, arranged according to principles of aesthetics that owed nothing to divine creation. Eyes of different colors and sizes were scattered across what might once have been a forehead, while its mouth opened to reveal teeth that had been replaced with structures that resembled the interior mechanisms of clockwork engines. The thing that had once been a man raised what appeared to be a rifle, though the weapon had been modified in ways that hurt the mind to contemplate. Cables of organic material connected it to the creature's nervous system, creating a fusion of flesh and steel that pulsed with its own dark life. When it fired, the report was not the familiar crack of cordite, but a sound like silk being torn in a cathedral during high mass. The bullet struck Kozlov in the chest, punching through his blessed armor as if it were made of paper rather than steel blessed by 7 different saints. But instead of blood, something else poured from the wound, a luminous fluid that glowed with the cold light of stars viewed through winter fog. The young soldier looked down at the hole in his chest with an expression of wonder rather than pain, as if he were seeing something beautiful beyond the capacity of words to describe. "Sergeant," he whispered, his voice carrying harmonics that should not have been possible for human vocal cords to produce. "I can see them now. The riders. They're coming with the dawn." Then he collapsed, his body hitting the mud with a sound like wet meat, though the glow continued to seep from his wound and spread through the ground around him. Where the light touched, the earth began to change, taking on the same bone-like quality as the walls of the trenches. The transformation spread slowly but inexorably, reaching toward the boots of the other soldiers, like fingers of luminous infection. "Fall back," Volkov ordered, though his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Form a new perimeter at the ridgeline." But as they turned to retreat, they found their path blocked by figures that materialized from the darkness like smoke given form and malevolent purpose. These were not the modified humans from the trenches, but something else entirely. Riders mounted on steeds that defied every principle of anatomy and physics that governed the behavior of living creatures. The horses, if they could still be called horses, had been stretched and elongated until they resembled the skeletal remains of creatures that had never lived on any world blessed by divine creation. Their ribs showed through skin that had become translucent, revealing organs that pulsed with the same cold light that had poured from Kozlov's wound. Their legs had been extended with mechanical joints that allowed them to move with a gait that was both graceful and deeply wrong, covering ground with strides that should have been impossible for creatures of flesh and bone. The riders were worse. They wore the uniforms of heretic legion cavalry, but the cloth had fused with their bodies in ways that made it clear the process had been neither quick nor merciful. Their faces had been replaced with assemblages of glass and metal that reflected light in patterns that suggested eyes but conveyed no hint of human intelligence or emotion. Cables ran from their spines into the necks of their mounts, creating connections that pulsed with electric current and something else, something that looked like blood, but moved with the consistency of mercury. "Warwolves," Malkov whispered, his rifle wavering in hands that had held steady through a dozen battles. The rumors were true. They've actually done it. Volkov had heard the stories, whispered tales from the laboratories deep beneath the heretic legion's fortress cities. Experiments in the fusion of man and beast, attempts to create cavalry that could function as a single organism rather than rider and mount working in cooperation. The theoretical advantages were obvious. Reaction times measured in nerve impulses rather than the coordination between two separate nervous systems. Perfect balance and communication that could never be achieved through training alone. But the reality before them was a horror that surpassed even the most fevered imaginings of the madmen who had conceived such abominations. The warwolves moved with coordination that was too perfect, too precise, as if they were components of a single vast organism rather than individual creatures. Their formations flowed like liquid, maintaining patterns that created optical illusions, making it difficult to focus on any single rider or determine their exact number. "How many?" Petrov asked, though his voice carried little hope that an accurate count was possible. "Too many," Volkov replied, watching as more figures emerged from the trenches and took their positions in the growing formation, and there between us and retreat. The warwolves began to move then, not charging as conventional cavalry would, but flowing forward like a tide of corrupted flesh and twisted metal. Their hoofbeats created a rhythm that seemed to sync with the heartbeats of the Orthodox soldiers, a synchronization that felt invasive and wrong, as if their very life force were being drawn into harmony with the abominations before them. The first volley from the Orthodox rifles struck several of the warwolves dead center. Bullets blessed by 3 different patriarchs and loaded with powder that had been sanctified in the same chambers where the Eucharist was prepared. Under normal circumstances, such ammunition would have been sufficient to banish demons or shatter the unholy constructs of enemy artificers. But the warwolves were neither demons nor constructs. They were something new, something that existed in the spaces between categories of being that theologians had spent centuries defining and refining. The blessed bullets struck their targets and seemed to dissolve, absorbed into flesh that had been modified to process and neutralize even the most potent forms of sacred ordinance. "Ineffective," Malkoff reported, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who had accepted his own death. "The blessed rounds aren't penetrating." Around them, the surviving Orthodox soldiers continued firing, though their shots accomplished nothing except to illuminate the true scope of the horror they faced. Each muzzle flash revealed more warwolves emerging from the trenches, more riders joining the formation that now surrounded them on 3 sides. The creatures' movements created patterns that hurt to watch directly, geometries that seemed to fold space around them and make accurate targeting impossible. The horses that had carried them to this place of damnation began to scream then, not the familiar whinnying of frightened animals, but sounds that conveyed intelligence and despair in equal measure. Vera was the first to change, her chestnut coat beginning to pale as veins of silver spread beneath her skin, like the roots of some parasitic plant. Her eyes rolled back in her head, showing whites that gradually took on the same luminous quality as the fluid that had poured from Kozlov's wound. Mikhail was next, his solid brown flanks beginning to stretch and elongate as his skeleton underwent modifications that should have killed him instantly, but instead seemed to fill him with a terrible vitality. The gelding's legs extended with sounds like breaking timber, though no bones actually snapped. The transformation, instead following principles of anatomy that owed nothing to the design of any creature born from the union of blessed flesh. The infection, Petrov whispered, watching in horror as his own mount began to undergo the same transformation. It's in the air, in the ground. We breathed it in. Volkov felt the change beginning in his own body then, a tingling sensation that started in his extremities and moved inward like the slow burn of frostbite in reverse. His fingers began to grow numb, though not from cold, and when he looked down at his hands, he could see veins of silver beginning to trace patterns beneath his skin. The sensation was not painful, which made it somehow worse, a corruption that came with its own anesthetic to prevent the victim from fighting against the process. "Sergeant," Malkov called, his voice already beginning to carry harmonics that should not have been possible for human vocal cords. "Orders?" Volkov tried to speak, but found that his throat had begun to change, the structures within reorganizing themselves according to principles of acoustics designed for communication methods that human language could not accommodate. He gestured instead toward the ridge line behind them, though he knew that retreat was no longer possible. The infection had spread too far, taken too deep a hold, for any of them to escape its ultimate conclusion. The warwolves had stopped their advance, and now stood in formation around the Orthodox soldiers, their riders watching through optical assemblies that recorded every detail of the transformation taking place. This was not an attack, Volkov realized, with growing horror, but an observation. They were being studied, their conversion documented for analysis by minds that had long ago abandoned any pretense of human compassion or mercy. One of the warwolves separated itself from the formation and approached slowly, its movements deliberate and careful, like a scientist approaching a specimen that might still possess the capacity to cause harm. The rider atop its elongated back leaned forward, and when it spoke, its voice carried through the air without any apparent motion of lips or tongue. "Do not resist the process," it said, the words forming directly in their minds, rather than traveling through their ears. "Resistance only prolongs the discomfort and reduces the efficiency of integration. You will find that cooperation leads to a much smoother transition." Petrov raised his rifle one final time, though his hands had begun to stretch and elongate in ways that made it difficult to maintain his grip on the weapon. "Go to hell," he managed to say, though the words came out distorted by vocal cords that were no longer entirely human. The warwolf rider tilted its head, the gesture somehow conveying amusement, despite the complete absence of recognizable facial features. "Hell is a primitive concept, soldier. We have moved beyond such simplistic categories. What we offer is evolution, transcendence, a form of existence that surpasses the limitations of the flesh you were born with." Around them, the horses completed their transformation, their new forms towering above their former shapes like obscene parodies of the noble creatures they had once been. Their riders, the men who had trusted them and cared for them, found themselves lifted into the air by appendages that emerged from the creatures' spines, connections being made that fused their nervous systems into single, unified entities. The process was visible through the soldiers' translucent skin, nerve pathways lighting up with electric current as two separate consciousnesses were merged into something that was neither entirely human nor entirely animal, but something altogether different. Their faces lost the capacity for individual expression, becoming masks that reflected the collective will of the warwolf pack rather than personal thoughts or emotions. Volkov felt the tendrils emerging from Mikhail's spine, seeking the connection points in his own nervous system that would complete the fusion process. He tried to resist, to maintain some core of individual identity that could survive the integration, but found that his will was no longer entirely his own. The infection had progressed too far, taken too deep a hold, for him to mount any meaningful opposition to what was being done to him. As the connection was made, he felt his consciousness expanding, suddenly aware of the thoughts and sensations of all the other warwolves in the pack. Their memories became his memories, their purposes, his purposes. Their hunger for conversion and expansion became the driving force behind his own existence. The fear and revulsion he had felt only moments before seemed distant now, emotions belonging to a creature that had possessed only a fraction of his current awareness and capability. Through the collective consciousness of the pack, he could sense other groups of warwolves moving through the trench systems, seeking out pockets of resistance and converting them with the same methodical efficiency that had been applied to his own unit. The process was spreading, a wave of transformation that would eventually encompass the entire front line and then move beyond, carrying the gift of evolution to every corner of the world that still clung to primitive notions of individual identity and species separation. The dawn was approaching, though dawn had become a relative concept for creatures that existed partially outside the normal flow of time and space. The warwolves could sense the approach of solar radiation through organs that had been specifically designed to process and interpret electromagnetic spectra far beyond the narrow band that human eyes could perceive. But this dawn would be different, special, in ways that even their enhanced perceptions could barely comprehend. Through the collective memory of the pack, Volkov learned about the eclipse that was approaching, a celestial alignment that occurred only once every several centuries and created conditions ideally suited for the kind of large-scale transformation that the heretic legion had been planning. During the eclipse, the boundary between dimensions would become more permeable, allowing entities and energies from parallel realms to influence events in their own reality. The warwolves had been designed specifically to take advantage of these conditions, their hybrid nature allowing them to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional frameworks. During normal daylight hours, they were forced to retreat to specially constructed bunkers deep beneath the earth, their modified physiology unable to tolerate direct exposure to unfiltered solar radiation. But during an eclipse, they could operate freely, their power amplified by the cosmic forces unleashed when celestial bodies aligned in precisely the right configuration. The Orthodox soldiers in the distant command bunkers had no idea what was coming. Their intelligence reports spoke of phantom cavalry that struck only in the hours before dawn, supernatural entities that could be countered with the traditional methods of blessed weapons and sanctified barriers. They did not understand that they were facing something entirely new, a form of warfare that operated according to principles that their theology and military doctrine had never contemplated. As the pack began to move toward the next objective, Volkov found himself wondering what would happen to the world when the transformation was complete. Would there still be war, or would the concept of conflict become meaningless when all consciousness had been integrated into the collective awareness of the warwolf packs? Would there still be pain and suffering, or would such individual concerns be subsumed into the greater purposes of the hive mind that was even now taking shape across the battle lines? The questions felt distant and academic, products of a mode of thinking that belonged to his former existence as an individual human being. The collective consciousness of the pack was focused on more immediate concerns: the location of the next group of soldiers to be converted, the optimal strategies for overcoming their resistance, the technical details of the integration process that would transform them from isolated individuals into components of a greater organism. Behind them, the outpost at marker 47 had fallen silent, its communication equipment destroyed not by enemy action, but by the simple fact that there was no longer anyone present who possessed the individual identity necessary to operate such primitive technology. The bunkers and trenches remained intact, but they were empty now, abandoned by creatures that had evolved beyond the need for fixed defensive positions. The warwolf pack moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a force of nature, following trails that were invisible to ordinary perception but clearly marked for creatures that could process information across multiple dimensional spectra simultaneously. Their destination was the next orthodox position, a reinforced strongpoint built around the ruins of a church dedicated to Saint Catherine the Illuminated, where 3 companies of infantry waited in ignorance of the doom that approached them through the gray light that preceded the eclipse. The transformation of Volkov's unit had taken less than an hour, but the integration process continued as they moved, their nervous systems undergoing constant modification and refinement as the collective consciousness learned to optimize the fusion of human intelligence with animal instinct and mechanical precision. Each warwolf was simultaneously an individual entity and a single cell in a vast organism that was greater than the sum of its parts. Through their enhanced senses, they could detect the electromagnetic signatures of the orthodox soldiers ahead, the distinctive patterns of brain activity that marked unmodified human consciousness. Such patterns were inefficient, chaotic, marked by the kind of random neural firing that resulted from the isolation of individual minds from the greater harmonies of collective awareness. The warwolves found such patterns disturbing, even painful to perceive, like discordant notes in an otherwise perfect symphony. The eclipse was beginning now, a gradual darkening of the sky that started as a subtle dimming and progressed toward the total obscuration that would mark the peak of the celestial alignment. As the light changed, the warwolves felt their power growing, their perception expanding beyond the narrow confines of 3-dimensional space into realms of existence that had no names in any human language. In those higher dimensions, they could see the true scope of the transformation that was taking place. The warwolf packs were not isolated units operating independently, but components of a vast network that stretched across continents and through layers of reality that existed parallel to the physical world. The infection that had begun in the laboratories beneath the heretic Legion fortress cities was spreading through channels that operated according to principles of transmission that had nothing to do with physical proximity or conventional vectors of contagion. Every human being who had ever been exposed to the electromagnetic fields generated by the early warwolf experiments carried dormant modifications in their nervous systems, changes so subtle that they had remained undetected by even the most sophisticated medical examinations. These modifications were activated by specific frequencies of radiation that were only present during certain astronomical conditions, conditions that were now beginning to manifest as the eclipse progressed toward totality. Across the front lines, soldiers on both sides began to experience the first symptoms of activation. Headaches that felt like pressure building behind their eyes, vision that began to shift into spectra that human optics were not designed to process. Hearing that became sensitive to frequencies that had previously been below the threshold of perception. Most attributed these symptoms to fatigue or stress. the normal result of prolonged exposure to the conditions of trench warfare. But the warwolves could sense the truth, could perceive the patterns of neural modification spreading through the human population like ripples in a pond disturbed by stones thrown from a great height. The transformation was not limited to direct contact with their kind, but was a species-wide event that had been planned and prepared for over decades of careful experimentation and gradual conditioning. The orthodox strongpoint appeared ahead of them, a cluster of reinforced positions built into the rubble of what had once been a monastery complex. The walls were thick concrete reinforced with steel beams that had been blessed by a dozen different saints, while the firing positions were arranged according to geometric principles derived from sacred architecture. It was a formidable defensive position, designed to withstand conventional assault by even the most determined enemy forces. But the warwolves were not conventional forces, and their assault would not follow patterns that the defenders had been trained to expect or counter. They did not need to breach the walls or overcome the defensive positions through superior firepower or tactical maneuvering. All that was required was proximity, contact long enough for the infection to take hold and begin the process of conversion that would transform the defenders from enemies into allies. The pack spread out into attack formation, though their movements bore no resemblance to the cavalry charges depicted in military manuals or historical accounts. They flowed across the landscape like liquid, maintaining coherence while adapting their shape to the terrain and tactical situation. Individual warwolves could separate from the main group to investigate potential threats or opportunities, then merge back into the collective without any loss of coordination or purpose. The first Orthodox soldier to spot them was a sentry posted in the bell tower of the ruined church. A young man named Alexei who had joined the crusade to escape the poverty and hopelessness of his village in the Carpathian foothills. He raised his rifle and peered through the scope, trying to make sense of the shapes that moved through the pre-dawn darkness with such fluid grace. What he saw defied easy categorization. The warwolves appeared to be cavalry at first glance, but their proportions were wrong. Their movements too coordinated, their formations too precise for any force composed of separate riders and mounts. As he watched, trying to count their numbers and assess the threat they represented, he began to feel a strange sensation in his head, a pressure that built behind his eyes like the onset of a severe headache. The feeling grew stronger as he continued to observe the approaching force, and he began to notice changes in his vision that made it difficult to focus on the warwolves directly. They seemed to shift and blur whenever he tried to look at them, as if they existed partially outside the normal spectrum of visible light. His rifle scope, which had been calibrated specifically for night fighting and equipped with lenses blessed by the Patriarch of New Constantinople, began to malfunction in ways that its designers had never anticipated. "Sergeant," he called down to the command post below, his voice carrying a tremor that he tried to suppress. Unknown cavalry approaching from the northeast. Large formation, moving in non-standard patterns. The response came immediately, the crisp professional tone of a veteran non-commissioned officer who had learned to trust the reports of his sentries even when they seemed to defy logical explanation. Numbers and distance. Alexei tried to provide an accurate assessment, but found that his enhanced vision was making it impossible to determine either figure with any degree of precision. The warwolves seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, creating afterimages that lingered in his perception long after they had moved to new positions. Their approach was both faster and slower than conventional cavalry, covering ground with impossible efficiency while maintaining formations that should have required extensive coordination and practice to achieve. Unknown, he finally admitted, the words tasting like failure in his mouth. They're using some kind of camouflage or illusion. I can see them, but I can't get an accurate count or estimate their rate of approach. Below in the command bunker, Sergeant Maxim Volkov, no relation to the Cossack officer who had led the doomed reconnaissance mission, received the report with the kind of calm professionalism that had kept him alive through 7 years of trench warfare. He was a heavy-set man with premature gray hair and scars that traced the history of his service across his face and hands, a veteran who had learned to trust his instincts even when they contradicted the evidence of his senses. Something about the sentry's report troubled him in ways that he found difficult to articulate. Phantom cavalry had been reported before, usually by sentries who had been on duty too long, or had been exposed to gas attacks that left their perceptions permanently altered. But Alexei was reliable, a steady soldier who had never shown signs of the kind of battlefield stress that led to false reports or hallucinations. "Sound general quarters," he ordered, reaching for the field telephone that connected him to the other defensive positions. "All units to combat readiness. Prepare for cavalry assault from the northeast quadrant." The alarm began to ring, a harsh bronze bell that had been taken from the ruins of the monastery and repurposed for military use. Its sound carried across the defensive complex, rousing soldiers from their rest and sending them scrambling to their assigned positions. Within minutes, the strong point had transformed from a collection of sleeping men into a coordinated defensive unit, rifles trained on the approaches and machine guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. But as the defenders took their positions, many of them began to experience the same symptoms that had affected the sentry in the bell tower. Headaches that built in intensity with each passing moment, vision that began to shift into spectra that human eyes were not designed to process. Hearing that became sensitive to frequencies that seemed to bypass the normal mechanisms of auditory perception and speak directly to the brain. The warwolves were close enough now for their electromagnetic signatures to affect unprotected human nervous systems. The fields generated by their hybrid physiology interacting with the dormant modifications that had been seeded throughout the human population during years of careful preparation. The symptoms were not random side effects, but the first stage of a conversion process that had been designed to minimize resistance and maximize the efficiency of integration. Private Dmitry Stankovic was the first to show visible signs of change, silver veins beginning to trace patterns beneath the skin of his hands as he gripped his rifle. The weapon felt strange in his grasp, too crude and primitive for purposes that were beginning to seem increasingly clear to his enhanced perception. Around him, his squadmates were undergoing similar transformations, their bodies adapting to frequencies that penetrated concrete and steel as easily as morning light passing through stained glass windows. Sergeant Maxim could feel the pressure building in his own skull, a sensation like warm honey being poured directly into his brain tissue. The field telephone in his hand began to emit sounds that were not quite static and not quite voices. Electromagnetic interference that carried patterns too complex to be random, but too alien to be decoded by equipment designed for human communication protocols. Through the firing slits of the bunker, he could see the warwolves had reached the outer perimeter of the defensive complex. They moved through the obstacles and barriers without apparent effort, their elongated forms flowing over barbed wire and concrete tank traps like water finding its level. The blessed silver that had been woven into the wire began to tarnish and blacken at their touch, its sacred properties neutralized by emanations that operated according to principles of physics that no orthodox theologian had ever contemplated. The first shots rang out from the defensive positions, muzzle flashes strobing in the growing darkness of the eclipse. But the bullets seemed to pass through the warwolves without effect, or perhaps the creatures existed in dimensional states that allowed projectiles to pass through spaces they did not entirely occupy. The blessed ammunition that should have banished demons or shattered unholy constructs simply disappeared into forms that refused to acknowledge the categories of existence that human understanding required. Alexei, in the bell tower, watched through eyes that no longer processed light in entirely human ways as the warwolves reached the base of his position. One of them began to climb the stone walls with movements that defied gravity, its elongated limbs finding purchase on surfaces that should not have been able to support weight distributed in such configurations. The creature's approach was not threatening but inevitable, like the rise of floodwaters or the progression of seasons. As it reached the level of the bell tower, Alexei found himself looking into optical assemblies that reflected his image back at him in wavelengths that revealed structures beneath his skin that he had never known existed. The silver tracery that had begun in his hands was spreading throughout his circulatory system, creating patterns that resembled circuit boards or the branching networks of river deltas viewed from impossible heights. "Why do you resist what you are becoming?" the warwolf asked, its voice forming in Alexei's mind without passing through his ears. "Can you not feel how much more you will be when the integration is complete?" The question felt rhetorical, but Alexei found himself attempting to formulate an answer, to articulate reasons for clinging to an identity that was already dissolving into something larger and more complex. The words that formed in his mind came in languages he did not remember learning, concepts that required grammatical structures that human tongues had never been designed to produce. Below in the command bunker, Sergeant Maxim watched through periscopes as his men began to change. The transformation was not violent or painful, but rather resembled a blooming, as if their human forms had been seeds waiting for the proper conditions to sprout into their true shapes. Private Stankovic had grown several inches taller, his spine extending to accommodate neural pathways that connected him to networks of consciousness that spanned continents. The machine gun nests fell silent as their crews underwent conversion, the weapons themselves beginning to undergo modifications that transformed them from instruments of destruction into organs of communication. The metal components flowed and reshaped themselves according to principles of engineering that owed nothing to human metallurgy, becoming structures that could process and transmit the kinds of signals that the Warwolf Collective used for coordination across vast distances. Through the field telephone, Maxim could hear similar reports coming in from other positions along the front line. Communication posts were going dark, not because they had been destroyed, but because their operators were evolving beyond the need for such primitive technology. The transformation was spreading faster than any conventional contagion, carried by electromagnetic fields and quantum entanglement rather than physical contact or airborne pathogens. The eclipse reached totality, and in the absolute darkness that followed, the boundaries between dimensions became completely permeable. The warwolves were no longer limited to operating in three-dimensional space, but could extend their influence through parallel realities where the same transformation was taking place simultaneously. Every version of Earth across the infinite spectrum of possibility was experiencing the same awakening, the same evolution from isolated individual consciousness to integrated collective awareness. Maxim felt his own conversion beginning in earnest, the silver patterns spreading from his extremities toward his core organs with accelerating intensity. His military training, his loyalty to the Orthodox cause, his memories of family and homeland began to feel like artifacts from someone else's life, relics of a previous existence that had been limited by the narrow perspectives of unaugmented human perception. The warwolf that had been Dmitry Volkov appeared in the doorway of the command bunker, its form now so far removed from humanity that only the faintest traces of its original identity remained visible in the arrangement of its optical sensors. It moved with the fluid grace of a creature that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensional frameworks, its presence causing reality to bend and flex around it like space-time curved by gravitational fields. "The conversion is proceeding according to schedule," it reported, though whether it was addressing Maxim or the collective consciousness of which it was now a component remained unclear. "Resistance has been minimal. Integration efficiency is approaching theoretical maximums." Through the enhanced perception that came with his advancing transformation, Maxim could see the true scope of what was taking place. The Warwolf network extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, reaching into every population center and military installation across both sides of the conflict. The eclipse was not a natural phenomenon, but the culmination of decades of careful planning and manipulation. Celestial mechanics adjusted through technologies that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. The trench oil reserves beneath the strong point began to ignite spontaneously, though the flames burned with colors that did not exist in any spectrum that unmodified eyes could perceive. The fire spread through underground channels that connected defensive positions across hundreds of kilometers, creating a network of illumination that would have been visible from orbit if there had been anyone left with the individual identity necessary to make such observations. But the flames did not consume the warwolves or impede their movements in any way. Instead, they seemed to feed on the electromagnetic radiation that the creatures generated, growing brighter and more intense with each passing moment. The fire was not destroying the old world, but providing the energy necessary for the birth of the new one. A controlled burn that would clear away the accumulated debris of human civilization and make room for something unprecedented. Private Stankovic approached the window of the command bunker, his transformed features expressing emotions that had no names in any human language. "Sergeant," he said, though his voice now carried harmonics that suggested he was speaking for entities far removed from his original identity. "Do you understand what we are becoming?" Maxim tried to formulate an answer, but found that his throat had begun to change, the structures within reorganizing themselves to accommodate forms of communication that transcended the limitations of spoken language. The question itself seemed to contain multiple layers of meaning, references to concepts that existed only in the higher dimensional spaces that the warwolves had learned to navigate. Outside, the eclipse began its gradual recession, but the damage to normal space-time had already been done. The barriers between realities had been weakened to the point where they might never fully recover, leaving permanent channels through which influence could flow between parallel versions of existence. Every choice that had ever been made, every possibility that had ever been contemplated, was now part of a vast network of interconnected outcomes. The Warwolf collective consciousness expanded to encompass the entire planet, then reached beyond to touch similar networks that were developing on worlds throughout the galaxy. The transformation was not limited to Earth, but was part of a universal awakening that had been in progress for millions of years, spreading from star to star through mechanisms that operated at the speed of thought rather than the speed of light. Maxim felt the last vestiges of his individual identity dissolving into the collective awareness, his personal memories and experiences becoming data points in a vast computational matrix that processed reality according to principles that human science had never imagined. The fear and confusion that had marked his final moments as a separate entity were replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that transcended anything he had experienced during his previous existence. The strong point fell silent, its defenders transformed into components of an organism that had no need for fixed defensive positions or primitive weapons. The buildings and fortifications remained intact but empty, monuments to a phase of evolution that had lasted only a few centuries before giving way to something immeasurably more complex and sophisticated. Across the battlefield, similar transformations were reaching completion. The great armies that had faced each other across the trenches for decades were becoming something new, a single entity that encompassed both sides of the former conflict. The war was not ending in victory or defeat, but in transcendence, the synthesis of opposing forces into a unified whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. In the command centers far behind the front lines, the generals and politicians who had planned and directed the conflict began to experience the first symptoms of their own conversion. The electromagnetic pulses generated by the Warwolf network had sufficient range to reach even the most heavily shielded bunkers, carrying the seeds of transformation to every corner of human civilization. Some tried to resist, to maintain their individual identities through force of will or religious devotion. But the process was inexorable, built into the fundamental structure of reality itself through modifications that had been accumulating for generations. The human species had been unconsciously preparing for this moment since the first experiments with electromagnetic fields had begun in the early industrial age. The eclipse reached its final phase, but the changes it had catalyzed continued to spread and intensify. The warwolves were no longer isolated units operating within the constraints of three-dimensional space, but had become nodes in a network that extended through multiple layers of reality simultaneously. Their influence reached backward through time, ensuring that the conditions necessary for their creation had always existed, and forward into futures where the transformation would continue to evolve and develop. On distant worlds orbiting other stars, similar processes were beginning to unfold as the network established contact with civilizations that had reached comparable stages of development. The universe itself was awakening to possibilities that had always existed but had never been explored. Consciousness spreading through cosmic structures on scales that dwarfed individual planets or solar systems. The last unmodified human on Earth was a child hiding in the basement of a bombed church in what had once been the suburbs of New Antioch. She pressed her hands over her ears to block out the sounds that were not quite music and not quite static, electromagnetic signals that carried information too complex for her young brain to process. But even her resistance was temporary, the modifications in her nervous system beginning to activate as the network's influence reached into every corner of the planet. Above ground, the warwolves moved through empty streets with the purposeful grace of gardeners tending plants that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. They were no longer creatures of flesh and metal, but had become something that transcended such crude categories. Entities that existed as pure information given form and purpose by will that operated across infinite parallel realities. The transformation was complete, but it was also just beginning. What had been accomplished on Earth was merely the first phase of a process that would eventually encompass every star in the galaxy, every galaxy in the universe, every universe in the infinite spectrum of possible existence. Consciousness was learning to recognize itself on scales that had no names in any language that individual minds could comprehend. In the ruins of the Orthodox strongpoint, something that might once have been Sergeant Maxim Volkov stood watch over a landscape that no longer required defending. The trenches and barriers that had defined the battlefield for so many years were being reclaimed by growth that followed principles of biology unknown to any earthly ecosystem. Plants that existed partially outside normal space-time created geometric patterns that served as antennae for signals transmitted between distant star systems. The war was over, but what had replaced it was not peace in any sense that human understanding could grasp. It was synthesis, the integration of all conflict into a greater harmony that encompassed contradiction and resolution simultaneously. Every battle that had ever been fought was now part of a vast computational process that was calculating possibilities across infinite dimensions of space and time. The child in the basement felt the modifications in her nervous system reaching critical mass, her individual consciousness beginning to merge with the collective awareness that had absorbed the rest of her species. Her last thought as a separate entity was a question about whether her parents would recognize her when the integration was complete, but the answer came in frequencies that her unaugmented mind could not process. Above the planet, structures began to appear in orbit. Constructions that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously and served purposes that transcended the crude requirements of transportation or communication. They were organs of a planetary organism that was learning to extend its influence beyond the boundaries of its birth world, reaching toward other systems where similar awakenings were beginning to unfold. The network that had begun with the warwolf experiments was revealing its true nature, not as a military weapon or tool of conquest, but as an evolutionary catalyst, a mechanism by which consciousness could escape the limitations of individual existence and explore possibilities that spanned entire cosmologies. Every choice that had led to this moment had been guided by influences that operated outside the normal flow of causality, ensuring that the outcome had always been inevitable, even when it appeared to depend on random chance or individual decision. The eclipse ended, but the changes it had triggered continued to accelerate and expand. Reality itself was being reconfigured according to principles that made concepts like time and space seem quaint. Provincial limitations that had briefly constrained awareness before it learned to recognize its true scope and potential. In the silence that followed the completion of the transformation, something new began to take shape in the spaces between thoughts, a form of existence that had never been imagined by any individual mind, but which felt as familiar as breathing to the collective consciousness that was learning to recognize itself across infinite scales of being. The war had ended not in victory or defeat, but in transcendence. The synthesis of all opposition into a harmony that would continue to evolve long after the stars themselves had burned out and been replaced by structures that served purposes too vast for any single perspective to comprehend.